Theodore Ashby lived by a single discipline for the better part of 4 decades. Never build anything you are not prepared to protect. He had learned it the hard way, the way most men in the Saguenay region learn anything that sticks, through cold winters, stubborn soil, and the particular silence of a region that does not reward impatience. He had built a timber processing operation from a single contract and a second-hand flatbed truck, turned it into a mid-sized enterprise with 22 employees, a sawmill outside Alma, and a reputation for delivering on time that people in the industry considered almost unreasonable. He had a daughter he called his clearest thinking, and he had trusted the woman he married with every corner of the life he had built over 21 years. That was the part he would spend the next chapter of his life recalibrating. On a Wednesday afternoon in November, when the first proper snow of the season was pressing down against the windows of the office he kept above the mill floor, his wife, the woman who was, as of that afternoon, no longer going to remain his wife, placed a legal envelope on his desk with the deliberateness of someone who had been rehearsing the gesture for months. He looked at the envelope. He looked at her. Lorraine Ashby stood across from him in the kind of composed stillness that psychologists call affect regulation, the deliberate suppression of emotional display in a high-stakes moment. She had it perfectly. She had always been good at it. He had once admired that about her. She had hired one of the better family law firms in Quebec City. The filing requested the mill, the property at Lac Saint-Jean, the investment accounts, and the Montreal condo they had purchased together in 2019. She had listed them with the practiced specificity of someone who had been taking inventory for a long time. She wanted to leave by January. She had, she said, already spoken to someone. A business consultant she had met through a professional network 18 months ago. His name was not relevant to the filing. Theodore set the envelope down on top of a quarterly supply order he had been reviewing. He did not raise his voice. He did not stand up. He looked out through the interior window that overlooked the mill floor, where 2 of his employees were running boards through the planer with the easy, rhythmic focus of people who had done the same motion 10,000 times. The overhead lights of the mill threw long shadows across the wood. Everything was exactly as it had been 20 minutes ago. Lorraine waited for a reaction. That was the part she had prepared for, his anger, his argument, the negotiation she had anticipated. She was ready for all of it. What she had not prepared for was the way he simply looked back at her, nodded once with the unhurried acknowledgement of a man who has just received information he already knew was coming, and said only, "I'll have my attorney look at this by Friday." Then he turned back to the supply order. She left without another word. She had expected a storm. What she encountered was something that unsettled her far more, stillness. And if she had understood what that stillness actually meant, if she had recognized it not as defeat but as orientation, the way a compass needle settles before it points somewhere with absolute certainty, she might have reconsidered everything that came next. She didn't, and that choice cost her more than she had any framework to anticipate. Psychologists who study divorce litigation have documented what they call the visibility trap, the deeply human tendency to assign value to what can be seen, touched, and publicly displayed, while systematically underestimating what exists below the surface. Lorraine had fallen into it completely. She had cataloged the mill. She had cataloged the properties. She had calculated the accounts. She had assessed every asset that appeared on a balance sheet or sat on a title deed under Theodore's name. She had not asked, not once in 21 years, about the structure underneath those things. Theodore called his attorney the next morning, not Friday, the next morning. Because there are men who say Friday and mean it, and there are men who say Friday and mean something else entirely, and every person who knew Theodore Ashby well understood which category he occupied. His attorney was a woman named Catherine, who had practiced family and commercial law in the region for 26 years, and had a reputation for being the calmest person in any room where something consequential was being decided. She had worked with Theodore twice before, once on a supplier contract dispute, once on a zoning matter when he expanded the mill in 2017. She knew how he operated. He placed the filing on her desk without preamble. She read it in full, asked 3 clarifying questions, and then set it down and looked at him over her reading glasses. She's asking for the mill, the Lac Saint Jean property, the investment accounts, and the Montreal condo. Based on visible marital assets, that's approximately 73% of what a court would assess at current valuation. I know. She studied him. Do you want to contest the valuation or challenge the asset list? Neither. He kept his voice level. I want you to draft an agreement that gives her exactly what she's asked for. Catherine put her pen down. Theodore. Every asset she listed. The mill operation, the lake property, the accounts, the condo. All of it, structured exactly as she requested. He folded his hands on the table, the way he always did when he had made a decision he had no intention of revisiting. With one condition. Lorraine must permanently and irrevocably sign away any claim to the Ashby family trust and all instruments held within it. The trust is to be excluded from the marital estate in full. Catherine looked at him for a long moment. She had seen a great many things in 26 years of practice. The expression on Theodore's face was one she could not immediately categorize. You understand what you're proposing, she said. Not as a question. Completely. She picked up her pen. Then I need you to walk me through the trust structure. All of it. Theodore opened the folder he had brought with him. He had come prepared, which Catherine noted but did not remark on. She simply began writing. And as he explained, she began to understand what she was looking at. Not as a surprise, but as the slow, deliberate reveal of something that had been constructed with extraordinary patience and considerable foresight. The Ashby Family Trust had been established 17 years earlier by a notary in Chicoutimi who specialized in estate planning for family businesses in the region. The trust held a controlling interest in the original timber operation. Not the mill building, not the equipment, not the contracts, but the underlying enterprise structure, the corporate entity from which every revenue stream flowed. The mill that appeared on the balance sheet as a marital asset was a subsidiary. The head company was the trust. The trust had a single named beneficiary, Theodore's daughter, Maeve, who was 19 years old and had never, in her life, been asked to think about any of this. Lorraine signed the agreement 11 days later at a legal office in Quebec City, in a blouse she had purchased specifically for the occasion, with a pen her consultant had given her as what he called a symbolic gesture. She smiled for a photograph she posted afterward, with a caption about new seasons and the courage to begin again. She had no idea she had just signed away access to the only mechanism that could have protected her from what was already in motion. The next months were, on the surface, exactly what Lorraine had planned them to be. She moved into the Montreal condo. She redecorated. She appeared at industry events with her consultant, who was well-dressed and confident in the particular way of men who have not yet discovered the difference between presenting well and actually being competent. She gave 2 interviews to a regional lifestyle publication about professional reinvention and building a life that reflects your actual values. The mill kept running. Theodore kept showing up. His employees noted that he arrived slightly earlier than usual and left slightly later. He did not explain why. He simply worked, which was the only explanation he had ever needed. His daughter Maeve was in her 2nd year of environmental studies at the Université du Québec à Chicoutimi. She had her mother's sharp eye for detail and her father's refusal to be rushed into anything. She came home for Thanksgiving weekend that November and found her father making tourtière in the kitchen of the smaller house he had rented in Alma after the lake property transferred. It was not a grand house. It had a good wood stove and a view of the river through the back window and a creaking step on the 2nd stair that he kept meaning to fix. He had not fixed it. She had noticed. She sat at the kitchen counter with her textbook open, and her attention entirely elsewhere, and said, without looking up, "You didn't fight for anything." He turned the dough. The kitchen smelled like pork and thyme, and the particular warmth of a house where someone cooks properly. "I fought for the right things," he said. "That's not an answer." He looked at her. She was watching him now, the textbook forgotten, her expression carrying the particular frustration of someone who loves a person and cannot make sense of their decisions. Psychologists call this epistemic distance, the painful gap between what you can see and what you cannot yet know. Maeve was standing in the middle of it, and it showed. He said, "Some explanations belong to their moment. When the moment comes, you'll understand. I promise you that." She went back to her textbook, but she did not look convinced, and he did not blame her. He understood that this season was asking something of her that she had not been prepared to be asked. Lorraine, meanwhile, had discovered that ownership is not always what it appears to be. The mill had been generating revenue for 3 years under a licensing agreement with the parent company, the trust, and that agreement had terms that were clearly documented and, for the duration of the marriage, quietly managed without requiring Lorraine's attention or awareness. She had never asked. Theodore had never obscured. The documentation had always been available. No one had reviewed it. The licensing fee was significant. It was also non-negotiable, established by the trust instrument and not subject to modification by any subsidiary agreement. When Lorraine's consultant, who had been advising her on the business transition she had been planning for 18 months, finally pulled the full corporate structure, he spent 40 minutes on the phone with a commercial attorney in Montreal before coming back to Lorraine with the information. She owed the trust, not in theory, in documented, structured, accrued obligation. The licensing fees for the period since the mill transferred into her possession, combined with the administrative costs the trust was entitled to recover, and the outstanding reconciliation from the asset valuation, produced a number that her consultant read aloud twice to make certain she had heard it correctly. She had heard it. She called her attorney, who advised her that the trust instrument was valid, properly executed, registered in full accordance with Quebec provincial law, and had been established 17 years prior to the current dispute, well outside any challenge window. The obligation was real, the structure was real, and the beneficiary, a 19-year-old university student currently writing an essay about boreal forest management, was entirely and legally protected. Her consultant suggested that there might be grounds for contesting the trust's scope. Her attorney suggested, more carefully, that he was not a commercial trust specialist and that his opinion on this matter was optimistic, in ways that were unlikely to survive contact with an actual courtroom. Lorraine told her attorney to file an emergency motion. She wanted the trust challenged. She wanted the structure reviewed. She wanted a court to agree that she had not been properly informed. Her attorney filed the motion. He did not think it would succeed. He filed it because that was what she was asking him to do, and because sometimes the work of a legal professional is to protect a client from the consequences of decisions they have not yet fully understood. The hearing was scheduled for late January. Theodore and Catherine were notified. Theodore read the notification, set it aside, and went back to a supply chain document he had been reviewing. He had been expecting it. The morning of the hearing, Theodore arrived at the courthouse in Chicoutimi 35 minutes early. He was wearing a dark gray wool suit he had owned for 12 years and had never found a reason to replace. It fit correctly. It did not require commentary. Lorraine arrived with her attorney and her consultant, who had come for reasons that were either emotional support or strategic presence, and turned out, under pressure, to be neither. She was wearing a tailored coat she had posted about the week before. She had a look of gathered confidence that people who understand the psychology of performance would recognize as compensation, the kind of visible certainty that appears most frequently in people who are managing significant internal doubt. She looked across the courtroom at Theodore. He did not look back at her. He was speaking quietly with Catherine, his portfolio open, his posture that of a man with somewhere to be after this, and every reason to expect he would get there on time. Lorraine's attorney presented the motion with professional efficiency. The trust was potentially structured to create unfair advantage. The client had not been made aware of the licensing mechanism. The asset transfer had occurred without adequate disclosure. The judge listened. She asked 4 questions. Her questions were precise and, to the attorney, faintly ominous. The questions of someone who has already located the problem and is establishing, for the record, that it exists. Catherine presented the trust documentation with the calm of someone handling papers she has handled many times. The trust instrument, the registration, the licensing agreement, which had been filed with Quebec's Enterprise Registry in the same quarter it was executed, the beneficiary designation, which had been updated once, 6 years ago, and not since. She placed each document on the bar table with the quiet finality of someone building something that does not require decoration. "Your Honor," she said, "the trust was established 17 years ago, registered in full accordance with provincial law, and has never been amended to include any marital assets. The licensing agreement between the trust and the subsidiary was an arm's-length commercial arrangement entered into with full legal formality. Every document was available. No concealment occurred." She paused. "Mrs. Ashby is a highly capable professional who conducted her own assessment of the marital estate prior to filing for divorce. She made her requests based on that assessment. The court is now being asked to revisit those requests on the basis that she overlooked documentation that was registered, accessible, and legally disclosed." The judge looked down at the trust instrument. She took her time. The courtroom had gone quiet in the particular way of spaces where something significant is being absorbed. Then she looked up. "The trust structure is valid. The licensing obligation is enforceable. The motion to challenge the trust's scope is denied." She looked at Lorraine directly. "Mrs. Ashby, you accepted an agreement that transferred the mill operation into your possession without reviewing the commercial structures underlying that operation. That was a decision made with legal counsel and adequate time. The court cannot undo informed decisions simply because their consequences have become apparent." The outstanding licensing obligation stood. The number entered the official record. Lorraine sat very still. Her consultant, 3 rows back in the gallery, had the expression of a man performing a rapid recalculation that was not going in the direction he had anticipated. He did not go to her when the session paused. He remained in his row, looking at the middle distance, his hands folded on his knees. When the hearing broke briefly, Lorraine went into the hallway. Her attorney stayed a step behind, giving her the distance of a professional who understood when the situation had moved outside legal remedy. Theodore came through the courtroom doors. A few minutes later, Catherine beside him, both of them already moving toward the elevator. "Theodore." Her voice caught him. He turned. She was standing near the window at the end of the hall, the winter light coming flat and white through the glass behind her. The tailored coat looked less certain than it had 2 hours ago. Everything about her posture had changed. The performance had come down, and what remained underneath it was simply a person standing in a consequence they had not believed was real until this morning. She pressed her hand flat against the wall, the gesture of someone steadying themselves against more than just physical balance. Psychologists call it grounding behavior, the unconscious reaching for a stable surface when internal equilibrium fails. "I was wrong," she said. Her voice had none of the control it normally carried. "About a lot of things." He looked at her. Not with anger, and not with the satisfaction that people who have been wronged sometimes permit themselves. What was in his face was quieter than either, the settled, permanent grief of a man who had spent 21 years learning someone and an even longer time coming to terms with the distance between who they were and who he had believed them to be. "You catalogued everything that was visible," he said. His voice was level. "The mill, the properties, the accounts." He paused. "You never once asked what was underneath any of it." She opened her mouth. He continued. "The trust is named for Maeve. I built it before she could speak in full sentences, not to protect it from you, to protect it for her." He held her gaze. "That's a distinction I need you to understand even now." He turned and pressed the elevator button. "She will never carry a debt I created," he said, mostly to himself, or perhaps to her. It was difficult to tell. That was always the point. The elevator opened. He stepped in. The doors closed. Maeve was waiting in the lobby. He had told her not to come. She had taken the bus from Chicoutimi anyway. Arriving 40 minutes before the hearing without telling him, sitting in the lobby with a thermos of coffee and her course notes open on her lap, reading nothing. She looked up when he came off the elevator. There was a pause, the held breath of a question she was not sure how to ask. Then she stood up and crossed the lobby and put her arms around him. Not a brief hug, not the performative embrace of someone demonstrating care. The real kind, the kind that comes from a person who has finally understood something they should have understood sooner and is choosing, in this moment, to let that understanding be physical. "I should have trusted you," she said into his shoulder. "I thought you gave up." He brought a hand to the back of her head, steady and unhurried. "I built a floor for you to stand on," he said. "Long before you needed it. I just couldn't tell you while it was being built." She pulled back far enough to look at him. Her eyes were bright. She had her mother's sharp eye for detail, and, he saw now more clearly than ever, entirely her own judgment about what to do with what she found. Why not? He considered the question with the seriousness it deserved, because some structures only hold if you don't disturb them before they're ready. He looked at her. "You're ready now." They walked out into the January afternoon. Chicoutimi in January has a particular quality. The cold is honest, the light is low and clean. The city goes about its business with the practical efficiency of a place that does not have the option of being precious about winter. Nobody stopped them. Nobody noticed the specific, quiet, foundational thing that had just been restored between a father and his daughter on the sidewalk outside the courthouse. The weeks that followed moved with the practical momentum of something that had been correctly structured from the beginning. Through the Ashby Family Trust, the instrument Theodore had established when Maeve was 18 months old in the offices of a notary on a Tuesday afternoon, while Lorraine was at a conference in Montreal, and he had driven down from Alma with a folder of documents and a very clear sense of what he was trying to protect. Maeve assumed her position as beneficiary in full. The trust's interest in the timber operation was confirmed and documented. The licensing structure was reviewed, adjusted for current commercial rates, and formalized with the kind of clarity that leaves no room for future misunderstanding. Lorraine's situation resolved itself with the particular speed of financial obligations that have been properly documented. The mill, which had seemed like the crown of what she had negotiated, became the source of an obligation she had not anticipated and could not comfortably service. The condo was sold. The consultant, whose expertise had proven more limited than advertised, was no longer in the picture by March, a departure that had been preceded by a conversation Lorraine did not discuss publicly, and which those who knew her understood to have been definitive. She reached out to Maeve in early spring, a message that was careful and measured and contained the particular verbal architecture of someone who has spent time preparing what they want to say. Maeve read it twice. Then she set her phone down on her desk, beside a paper she was finishing on watershed management in the Boreal region, and she sat with it for a few minutes. She did not respond that day. She thought about it over the following week, not with anger, which would have been easier and less useful, but with the kind of deliberate consideration her father had modeled for her across her entire life, without ever explicitly naming it as a model. She thought about what she wanted to be true about herself, and what she wanted to be true about her relationship with her own history. Then she wrote back. A single paragraph, direct, not unkind, not warm. The message of someone who has made a decision about what kind of person they intend to be, and who recognizes that the decision belongs entirely to them. The door is not closed, she wrote, but it opens from your side, when you're ready to be honest about what happened. Not the legal version, the real one. I'll be here. She sent it, went back to her paper, and did not wait for a reply. Theodore did not know she had sent it. She told him a week later, over dinner at the house in Alma. Pasta he had made badly, and she had fixed without commenting on the original state of it, which was itself a form of inherited grace. He listened to the whole thing. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. That sounds exactly right, he said. She passed him the bread. Outside, the river was just visible through the back window. In the last light of an April evening, the ice finally beginning to break up at the edges, the slow, unhurried announcement of a season changing over into something new. Theodore thought, not for the first time, about the morning 17 years ago when he had sat in that notary's office with a folder of documents and made a decision he could not explain to anyone at the time. Not fully, not without revealing things he was not yet certain of. He had simply known, with the clarity that comes to some people in moments of genuine consequence, that the most important things he would ever build were not the things that appeared on any balance sheet. He had built a floor for his daughter to stand on. He had built it before she needed it, before she could understand it, before he even knew for certain what shape her life would take. He had built it because that was what it meant to protect something real. Some people build for what can be seen. Some people build for what will hold. The difference between those two things, Theodore had learned through more years than he cared to calculate, was the only difference that ultimately mattered. He reached for the bread. The river moved outside the window. The April light held for another few minutes, and then let go.